Hello, welcome to Legalese. I'm attorney Christopher Lilly. I'm the host of the show. Today we have a very special show, a show dealing with the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is celebrating its 800th anniversary here in 2015, and we didn't want the year to go by without a recognition of sorts of the Magna Carta and to discuss the same with you. I'm joined today by Judge Barbara Pearson. Judge Pearson is a judge who was appointed to the Lowell District Court. She was appointed in 1993, but she appears in other courts as well as in the area of Lowell and all throughout the Commonwealth. But she's also appeared quite a bit in the Air District Court, where I see Judge Pearson quite a bit. Judge Pearson is currently on the board of the American Inns of Court Foundation. That's a national foundation. She is on the executive committee and is the past president of the Boston chapter of Inns of Court. And Judge Pearson, I'll ask you to describe what are the Inns of Court?
Well, first of all, Mr. Lilly, thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful
Thank you for coming.
here.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. It's fun to be here. And actually, from the Inns of Court is where I became excited about the Magna Carta. But the Inns of Court was fashioned after the British Inns of Court, where in England, the lawyers and the barristers, who are the trial lawyers, meet. They break bread often, and they work on a mentoring system to promote excellent civility and professionalism. Our Chief Justice in 1975, Warren Burger, brought the Inns back to the United States and said what a great concept it was, and that's how it began. The Boston Inn was the 100th inn founded in this country, and we are a group of lawyers and judges and law students dedicated to professionalism, excellence, and civility, and that's what we do.
Now, you and I have both individually done some reading into the Magna Carta in preparation for today's show, but you've done a little bit more in terms of some of the celebration through the Inns of Court. What have you done?
Through the Lowell Bar Association on Law Day, Judge Pat Flynn, who's a juvenile court judge, and I went to one of the schools in Lowell, and we taught the 7th graders about the Magna Carta, which is a difficult thing to do since it was 800 years ago. But we did it in a way to introduce them to history, and especially the beginnings of the jury trial. What we did is we took the case of Hernandez, who was well known to all the people, all the students knew who he was anyway, and we did a mock trial to show them that in 1215, Hernandez may well have been above the law. He was wealthy, he was an athlete, he was a good-looking guy, and the law wouldn't have applied to him. But in 2015, and since our Constitution, he, like everyone else, is equal under the law and presumed to be innocent of every crime and has a right to a jury trial. So we showed them how a jury is picked, and we had a great time with that.
So the right to jury trial is one of the concepts that we talk about when we talk about the Magna Carta. And I think the overarching questions or issue that we'd like to present to you today is the idea of what is the Magna Carta and how does it apply to us, or how does it affect us as Americans 800 years later. Now, I think I'd like to start with what the Magna Carta isn't. And there are some fictions, I think, out there that the Magna Carta is a foundational document establishing some foundational law that was signed by King John and was presented to him by his barons. And a lot of that is not necessarily true, correct?
The Magna Carta speaks as a great charter, Magna Carta. It was written in Latin, and it came to being because there was a battle at Runnymede where the barons were fighting with the king because the king was overreaching. He was in charge of everyone. He would find somebody guilty and nobody could challenge it. He would take land from the barons and without giving them a right to be heard about it. It became very controversial, and the barons were fighting with the king, and to end the war and to make some sort of peace, he agreed that he would put his seal to this Magna Carta, this great document, which basically provided that everybody would have a voice before there was any taxation, that the people would be heard before someone was convicted of a crime, and they were basically trying to put in check the king's powers. He was not a very good king, and people didn't like him.
Wasn't a very good man.
He was not a very good man. Even A.A. Milne, the well-known poet, wrote about King John, saying that he was not a very good man. And in fact, he reneged on that charter. It only took 3 months before he repudiated. He got the church even to say that it was a document that was not to be recognized. And maybe he got his comings too because he died not too long after that of dysentery, I think.
I think you're right. There was, as I understand it, he got Pope Innocent III to declare the document null and void. And from that, civil war broke out. And through that civil war, we found John lost his life, I think probably through dysentery, but not necessarily through a war wound. But when we talk about the Magna Carta itself, the Great Charter, we aren't talking about what we as Americans might think of as a constitutional document,
right,
or a Declaration of Independence, which are, you look at those and you almost revere the document itself as being a great charter. This wasn't necessarily a great charter. In fact, it wasn't even signed by the king. He swore to it. I think he had in mind that he swore to it to just put off the barons and to move on.
To move them along, right.
But there was a lot in that document dealing with fishing rights and everything else that weren't necessarily what we believe the Magna Carta to be today, or what in popular terms the Magna Carta might be thought of.
I think you raised earlier that we've really fictionalized it, but there were parts of it that have continued and stayed with us even till today. And the Magna Carta came back when, and we won't go through all the history because we're not exactly experts on history, but there were 4 radiations, I think, of the Magna Carta, and many of the feudal rights that don't have any relevance today were sort of put aside. But there were some very basic tenets of the Magna Carta that through history have been referred to, and the Magna Carta gets a lot of credit. Maybe not necessarily where it's owed, but we're going to give it the credit anyway because it did instill, for example, the right to a trial by jury. They didn't have trials by juries exactly as we have them today, but the concept of people judging people as opposed to the king coming down and making a judgment.
So trial by jury wasn't necessarily new at that point, but there were other forms of trials that occurred.
Juries actually weren't allowed to convict in those days. They could find someone not guilty, but they couldn't convict, and that became a problem. But they were people, they were communities. They called them Eyres, E-Y-R-E-S, and they were at the court, and they would go from town to town, and that didn't work out very well. So eventually, they had courts that stayed in one place. But they were people judging other people, and really established the rule of law. So it became a rule of laws, not a rule by monarch.
There was also means of trials that didn't involve juries at all. Trial by ordeal, for instance, trial by battle, Game of Thrones type of situations where it had its basis in history, and they certainly fell into disfavor, thankfully, and were eventually replaced with the trial by jury. But it was a process, and it was a process that found its or found some basis in the Magna Carta.
Yes.
But let's take a look at the situation as it existed in 1215. I keep doing that.
Well, that's okay, because in 1225, I think there was another Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was repudiated, but then there was another one and another one, and it was written. I think there were 4 originals.
It was reissued and reissued a number of times. I think more than 30 times over the course of a number of years. But as we started talking, John was not a very good king. not a very good man. There were stories of John mistreating. There was this one family, the d'Abruzzi family, that William d'Abruzzi was a knight of John's that was on his side. John was thought to have disposed of his own nephew, who may have had a better claim to the throne. D'Abruzzi may have had some hand in helping him with that. I don't know. But apparently Mr. d'Abruzzi's wife had made a bad comment to the king, such that the king ended up going after d'Abruzzi. D'Abruzzi ran, he was an outlaw. He ended up dying an outlaw in exile. His wife and child were taken custody by John, put in prison, and ordered by the king, without any trial, basically at the whim of the king,
Right. That's what.
to be starved to death. And they say that the scene when they opened up that jail cell later could rival any scene, horrific scene you'd see on television
And that's
today.
the horrors of King John.
That was the horrors of King John. And actually, he repented of that, I guess, on his deathbed.
But all the kings were not as bad as John.
No,
and
but
as the
many
kings
of them
went
were.
forward, yes.
Many
but
of
as
them were.
the kings went forward, and they did accept the Magna Carta, and in fact, there were some penalties for the king if he hadn't. Didn't apply to John because he repudiated, but others, as it went forward, did.
And that's, I think, referred to as the security clause. When what happens when the king decides, you know what, I'm not going to be bound by this. Well, what happens? Does the king give up his rights to be king? And I think that the civil war that followed months later, after he decided he wasn't going to follow this, was an action being taken by the barons against him. Now, William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, ended up serving as regent for King Henry III, who replaced. He was 9 years old at the time of John's death.
He was.
But he was to be the next king in line. William of Pembroke, and through him, the Henry III thereafter, ended up establishing and reissuing and celebrating the Magna Carta as it went on. So I think that really became where the Magna Carta became entrenched in the years after John's death. The Magna Carta is referred to by a number of scholars throughout history. We have 800 years of Magna Carta. In the time of the 1600s, the 17th century, William Coke was a great attorney,
Chief Justice.
Chief Justice,
In
Attorney
England.
General, Member of Parliament. He was dealing with issues involving King Charles, King James the First, who, and I think that ended up leading into the English Revolution. But Edward Coke had written quite a bit on the subject of the Magna Carta. And in referring back to the Magna Carta at that point, had certainly, I think, created the document as being perhaps a little more than it is, but had referred to it as a foundation of law that is the basis for all English rights, and used that to be able to write the Petition of Rights of Englishmen that had occurred at that point. And I think Edward Coke is credited with perhaps bringing those rights from the nobility, we were talking barons at first, to really the common man, so that it's not that all free men are entitled to due process of law, or not all nobles are entitled to due process of law.
But all people.
All men are
And
at
it used
that
to
point.
be
At
all
that
men.
point, at
It
all
did.
men.
It used
Now
to be
it's
all men.
people.
So then we crossed over the ocean.
Yes.
And the colonists came, and the British colonists came and said, we want to retain the rights of the Magna Carta. We are free. We want to retain our freedom. The king didn't think so. That was really the genesis of our states' constitutions. Well, they weren't even states yet, but William Penn wrote the fundamental laws of West New Jersey, drew from the Magna Carta, that substituted, at that time when we talked, they had a jury trial, and they substituted jury of one's peers for 12 good and lawful men, is what he said, for the juries. And then even in Massachusetts now, we have in our Massachusetts Constitution reference to the Magna Carta. But remember the Tea Party?
The Tea Party was a big...
The Tea Party, not the Revolutionary Tea Party, or the Tea Party in the Revolutionary time, when the tea was being taxed. And the American colonists said, no, no, we're not having any taxation without representation, going back to the Magna Carta. And so the 17th century and the 18th century in America built our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, on the Magna Carta and the rights that were thought to be given to the English who were now transplanted to America.
So let's break that down a little bit. The idea of Americans breaking free of England actually begins with the idea that Americans, at that point English subjects, felt that they were entitled to the same rights that any English man would be entitled to. And as such, the idea of taxation, no taxation without representation, meant quite a bit to them at that point, correct?
It did, and the colonists basically brought the perception of the Magna Carta as a written embodiment of our fundamental law protecting the rights and liberties of Englishmen anywhere, not just in England, but they said, okay,
sure,
we're here, we're keeping those rights wherever we go.
Kind of an extension of what Coke had brought out.
In fact, and Coke in 1606 wrote the Virginia Charter, which had the Magna Carta. Well, that's what I'm told.
Yeah.
That's what I've read. Again, Massachusetts resolved to appoint men to frame a body of grounds in law after the Magna Carta.
And that was John Adams?
That was John Adams.
And Samuel, I think, as well.
They used Magna Carta as a rallying point for seeking protection against arbitrary government. We in the it wasn't the United States yet, but the American colonists used the Magna Carta and its references and freedom to totally overthrow anything to do with the king, whereas the barons used the Magna Carta and subsequently to contain the king. So in our Declaration of Independence, we're throwing out the king's reign altogether.
If the king is not going to give us the rights to which we are entitled, we will separate from the king.
Exactly, and so declare our independence. So John Adams spoke of where public interest governs, government of laws, not of men. And subsequent to that, I think it was quite long thereafter that women became able to be on juries. But for lots and lots of years, there weren't any women. However, we will still take the good part of the Magna Carta with regard to the jury of one's peers coming from the Magna Carta.
The idea of government of laws and not of men, I think, harkens back to the idea of John being the all-powerful king.
Yes,
and
as
the question of where does the law come from? Does it come from the king, which is what it was believed to be back in feudal times.
Right.
All property comes from the king. All power comes from the king. Now we're not talking about that. And I think the Magna Carta touches on that to a great extent.
It was a check on the king, but to say that you needed to have fair laws applying to everyone fairly, not just the king deciding what the law was going to be, who was going to be thrown out. In King John's time, one of the punishments would be that you would abjure, you would be kicked out of your community or the country altogether if you did wrong, and he could arbitrarily do that.
Right.
So the rule of law is imposed against the arbitrary imposition of laws.
It basically brings the king subject to the law now, as opposed to the king being the source of the law.
Absolutely, which is interesting in our Constitution with the executive and the legislative and the judiciary, the three branches of government, all equal and all people equal under the law. so that before taxation can be imposed, the legislature has to vote it in. It can't be arbitrarily imposed by the executive.
Right.
So our checks and balances in our Constitution will mock what they were fighting against the kings, to say no more arbitrariness. The people will have voice in everything.
Now, the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, spelled out certain inalienable rights. And I think that also harkens back to the Magna Carta.
Absolutely.
And the idea of these rights coming from nature as opposed to from the king.
One of the interesting parts in the Declaration of Independence was the right of free emigration from state to state. You didn't have to get permission. You could just go over a state border wherever you wanted to. Whereas back in the king's days, in feudal time, you couldn't do that. And as I said, you could get kicked out and you couldn't come back again. So all the states had equality, and the ban on public land taking without compensation. If the government wants your land, you have to be fairly compensated to it. Also, we're
Sure.
back from the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Independence, the jury trial, and the ban on excessive fines as well, so that couldn't be arbitrary.
As well as excessive taxes. I think taxes featured quite a bit into all of this.
Well, that's another discussion for another time about what's a tax and what isn't. But excessive fines are usually by statute. A fine is imposed by statute, and a statute imposed by the legislature, where the people have a voice because they vote for the people who write the statutes.
Now, obviously after the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, we get into the finding of the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution being, to a great extent, a document dealing with the breakdown of the U.S. government and the various branches of government. But then we get into the amendments and the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights.
And how is the Bill of Rights affected by the Magna Carta?
Well, interesting, from my reading and in our discussions, a lot of the original founders wouldn't sign the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. It was so important that it was to put the people first with regard to the rights that they had. Equality under the law, and the right to trial by jury, the right of freedom of speech, of freedom of expression, all of the bills of rights. And we've done a lot with the schools too, when we talk about the different, the Bill of Rights and the different, the rights that we have. Again, taking their genesis from the Magna Carta.
Now, as we said, the Magna Carta has gone through a number of different iterations. It's been released, it's been honed down. I don't know that it necessarily survives in England at this point in and of itself as an item of law.
No, just as a document written in Latin. I
Yeah.
think there were 4 copies, one of which now is in the United States, and just I think sold to someone for millions of dollars in the United States, one of the 4 copies. And one was just on, and I don't know if it was that one, but it was on display in the Museum of Fine Arts this past summer in recognition in Boston, in the Museum of Fine Arts, in honor of the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. Before that, though, we had a copy of the Magna Carta at the World's Fair, which sounds kind of an odd place to have it.
Back in World War II.
Right before World War II, and the Americans actually kept the copy at Fort Knox to protect it, because they were afraid if it went back to Britain in the war that it could be destroyed. So we kept it in Fort Knox for
with the British permission.
With their permission, because
Yes.
it was theirs. We were going to keep it. We offered to keep it, and they said no, they wanted it back. So they got it back. But then one copy was sold.
Yeah.
But it's revered, and I think if you went to the Museum of Fine Arts to see it, it's kind of this rumpled little piece of paper that you could barely read in Latin.
Is it still there?
No, I
No?
don't think so.
Where is it now? Do you know?
I don't know unless it's there's one copy of it in the National Archives in Washington, so you can see it when you walk up the stairs into the National Archives. You'll see the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta also, I don't know if we've even talked about it, is shown on the doors that go into our Supreme Court, King John holding a copy of the Magna Carta, as well as when you go into the Supreme Court, where I just had the honor of being last month to celebrate the Magna Carta and its 800th anniversary. There is a frieze. There are friezes all around the court room itself, one of which has King John holding the Magna Carta. And so it's very exciting that we are not letting go of that.
No, it certainly sounds like it's been recognized for what it has done for our system of laws. So it really is a document that has become quite a document or a concept, I guess.
Concept. It stood the test of time somewhat as a myth, but it's a symbol of law circumscribing governmental power, and that's what it stands for. I don't think that 800 years ago it was ever envisioned that the jury system would be as it is, that the freedoms would ring as they are. But we have to credit what happened, and it's amazing to think 800 years ago.
800 years ago, a failed treaty,
has now
which led to a civil war, was allowed to survive and continue and thrive and build through England, through the United States.
And many free countries all over the world. And actually Eleanor Roosevelt, when the UN had a Declaration of Rights, referred to it as the Magna Carta of Rights. So all through history, and if you don't understand history, you can't appreciate what we have. So I think it's really important that we do celebrate it. And it's exciting. And you and I have learned a lot about it.
We sure have. One book that I found fascinating, that was very helpful, was a book called Magna Carta, The Birth of Liberty by Dan Jones. It really goes into the history and describes quite a bit the history as well as how it's transformed through to America and what it means to us. And you've also...
This is another Magna Carta muse and mentor, which a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but this song goes on, and it has served as a mentor for so many of our founding fathers throughout our history. This was written by the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court with a foreword by Chief Justice Roberts, but it's all, they're different stories, so it's not a whole, you don't have to read it from cover to cover. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote a piece in it. It's also really to be commended. And I think you found a book about the Magna Carta in miniature or something?
It was a Kindle single. I can't remember
Magna
who wrote
Carta
it.
1215.
1215 and All That, I think it was called, about the Magna Carta. That was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, quick read. Actually, a lot of fun. So there's quite a bit out there to be examining on the Magna Carta. I think we can't do the Magna Carta justice in half an hour.
Not at all.
It's an 800-year-old concept that has gone on and will continue to go on and will continue to inspire. And I want to thank Judge Pearson for joining us and talking about the Magna Carta. I think this has been a lot of fun, and I want to thank you all for watching.